Hello everyone, welcome back. We're going to go over the midterm today, or the prep for the midterm. So first off, let me explain. Last year when I taught this, the midterm was a practical test, in which case you processed different crime scenes and then wrote up everything that you learned from it and presented it like you would in a case report. So I'm really sorry. I feel like that's an important part of this class, and doing this class online is difficult in that regard because I think it takes away an important aspect of it. But what I hope you'll get from it is these concepts that we're learning about and we're talking about and you're reading about won't be new to you when you come across them someday, should you go into this field. They'll at least be something you can look back on and say, okay, I was exposed to that and I learned something from that. So that's my goal with this. And so I feel like while it's not the same, it's still going to be very worthwhile. And there's a lot of good stuff that we're talking about. So to get started with here, I'm going to just kind of go through what you might find on the test. Okay, so let's get started. Let's talk about chain of custody. So chain of custody is a really important aspect, and you need to be able to document everything from the time that you locate the item, you recognize that it's of evidentiary value, you are the one who located it, and then you're going to mark it, photograph it, do all that type of thing, and then you're going to package it and then write it on the search warrant what happens. And so every step you take, from getting it processed on scene to transporting it securely back to the station to impounding it into evidence, all that is documented. And if there's ever any kind of a break in that process, even if it's however short, you want to mention that in your report. A point that I want to make about this is you always want to be upfront about everything that you do. If a mistake is made, that's okay. Mistakes happen. We are human, but you must document it and let the prosecutor know and everyone else involved know, so that it doesn't come up later in court, because then it's going to taint everything that you do. So always err on the side of being very forthright. I also want to ask, next up item here, what's the thing that you should do when you're getting ready to leave a scene? So think about that. What are the last steps involved with that? And there's a couple spots in the book that talk about that, but you think about everything that you've done, and it's pretty common sense when you're working on something. So think about what the last step on the scene is. Packaging is a big one, and thinking about different things. We're going to learn about packaging in general. I've talked about paper bags and not in plastic. I don't know if we've talked about, but it's certainly been in the book, regarding arson, how you want to package that. You also want to talk about small trace fibers, that type of thing, how to package those things. What's the best method of packaging those things? Here's another one, talking about coroner and medical examiner. Remember, coroner is an elected official who may not be a doctor even. They're just an elected official who handles the work of the dispensing of the dead person. So a medical examiner, of course, is a formally trained doctor in that field. So, and they perform the post-mortem, would also called autopsies. So think about those, coroner versus medical examiner. When you're talking about courtroom and testimony, you want to be able to say who made the statement, and it's best if you hear it directly. And if it's not made by you directly, or you heard it directly, then it would be called something else. So I want you to think about that. I want to talk about sketching. Sketching may seem not important, but it really is. And there's a real simple way, I think I've mentioned it a few times, that I like to use. It uses the X and Y axes, and there's two methods in there. In the book you'll see about the best method of sketching. There's some other ways of doing it. I like to keep it simple, and it's fast, and once you get good at it, you can knock out a sketch fairly quickly. So think about the best use of the X and Y axes. What's the required information on a sketch? Think about that. I think there's some information in the book. In particular, the things that the defense attorney or prosecutor might ask you. Is it to scale? Where's north? That type of thing. That's going to be very important. Question of why do you do the sketch? So there's a number of reasons why. You may want to think it's too much work. We've captured it in photographs, or the scene scanner is here. But it's like sometimes those things don't work, and it may not be as clear. It may be cluttered. So a sketch is a basic, generally an overhead view, and it's really, really simple. So there's a lot of good reasons why we do sketches. Thoughts about processing a scene, and you come across, maybe you have a technical question. I want you to think about where would I go for resources for that, or do I even need to? That's real important. But there's a couple of resources out there. One in particular we have in our state that's absolutely terrific. I want you to look that up. We've already mentioned this once before about the process of an item of evidentiary value from start to completion, and the completion would be once it's impounded at the station and then it's brought out for court purposes. There's a process for what that's all called. I want you to learn about or look into the different characteristics of evidence. What's the difference between evidence that would maybe, let's call it Chevrolet Impala, that you find on scene, and there's of course thousands of Chevrolet Impalas, but that would be a certain type of characteristic. But then there's something about that. Maybe it's got a bumper sticker on the back, maybe it's got a dent on the right rear quarter panel. That's called a different type of characteristic. So know what those things are. So I want you to think about what's the first thing you do on processing a crime scene. A couple of aspects of it. Say you are just arriving and the scene is not secure. I want you to think about that. We've talked about the priorities of life. And then I also want you to think about what the first steps are when the priorities of life have already been taken care of. I'm going to mention something about robberies. On a side note, remember we talked a little bit earlier about robberies versus burglaries versus thefts. People get the name, they call everything a robbery. It's not. Robbery is toward people. So, and you might say, well, what about a bank if people call it a bank robbery? Well, if the bank was closed and someone broke in and stole the money, it would be a bank burglary. But if it's open and there's people in it, then it's a bank robbery. So we're going to talk about robberies here. So think about the investigative steps of a robbery. So picture a mini mart of some kind and that was robbed. They get robbed quite regularly. So think about things you want to look for, types of impressions maybe left behind. Think about where the suspect came from, where the suspect went to. Are there video cameras around? Think about different steps that might be involved in something like that. Okay, earlier I had mentioned that we make mistakes, we're humans. So thinking about if you've inadvertently transferred trace evidence, what do you do? What's the most important thing? And I think I mentioned that previously. We always want to disclose what we do, document it. That's super important. Next up, scene's been made secure. We've gone through the priorities of life. Everything is taken care of. What's your next step? You've got your perimeters set up. What's your next step? I want you to think about the initial processing and remember those questions of who, what, where, when, why, how. So number one is probably going to be asking some questions about what to do next. Think about problems faced by CSIs. Imagine the officers are all pouring to the scene, take care of the exigency, and then who's left behind? The CSIs are left behind, or they're called out. There's officers who remain on scene to protect the scene, but then the CSIs may get called out. So what are the potential pitfalls that you're going to face as a crime scene investigator? And there's many, because you're going to be there a long, long time. Scenes take a long time to process. So think about all the different things that can happen to you, weather, people getting a hold of you, just fatigue, everything that can possibly happen. I want you to think about search warrants. Why do we get them? What are they based off of? What do you have to have in order to obtain a search warrant? But you'll go before a judge, you'll contact your prosecuting attorney as well, and then think about what the steps are based on that, and think about who issues that search warrant. And I want you to think about the different types of searches. When you're looking for evidence, say picture a shell casing, a bullet shell casing that's in a yard in tall grass. Think about your ways of doing that. How might you do that? Different methods of searching. There's a few. We go back to the first priority of the initial responding officers. Think about the priorities of life. Where do people, innocent people, hostages, where do officers fall? Where does the suspect fall? And then think about where evidence fits into that picture. So think about that. Know what evidence is. Know how it's defined. Know what a forensic technician is and the other different terms regarding crime scene investigation. Mentioned, I think before, one of my favorites is Locard's Law. I just find it absolutely fascinating, and I find it so true in so many cases. So know what that is, and know what forensic science means. What's that term about? You may look at this video and say, hey, that's pretty much the test, and to be honest, it really is going to prep you well for the midterm exam. I want you all to succeed. I want you to look at these tests as an opportunity to learn as well, not just bust through them and call it good. but to think about it. I'm going to give you plenty of time to work on it. I think it's open for a week if I remember correctly. Just want you to do it well. If you have any questions at all, please reach out to me. I don't mind. I'm not going to give you the answer, but I'll certainly help you any way I can to find it. If any of my questions aren't clear, that always worries me as well. So ask. Don't ever hesitate to ask. There's no problem, no penalty for anything like that. So please get a hold of me. You remember that from the first video and from the syllabus about how to get a hold of me. So take care, good luck, and I hope everybody does very well in the test, and see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.